In this video, we're going to start to look at functions, and we're going to start off with some basic functions. But what is a function? A function is a block of statements that performs an action. It can receive parameters, and it can return a value by issuing a return statement. Once we define a function, we can call it from other pieces of code, and that function can do something for us, and it can return an answer if we want it to. To declare a function, we start out with the function keyword. So we say function, and then we give the function a name. And that name should have some meaning. It should describe what the function does. Somebody that looks at this function being called in their code should immediately understand what kind of function we're calling and what that function is going to do for us. And there is one exception to that, and we'll look at that in a minute. Inside parentheses, after the function name, we can specify parameters that we want people to be able to pass into the function when they call it. And then we have a block of code inside some curly braces, and that's where we put all the statements that will run once our function is executed. So here's an example. This is a function. It's called show year, and you can tell by the name of this function that it's going to show us a year. Good name. So we declared a constant called today, and it's a new date object. So we talked about date objects in a couple previous videos. So we create the new date object, which will have today's date in it, and we assign it to this constant called today. And then it's going to alert this year is, and it's going to use the get full year method of the today object to tell us what year it is. So this is a little function. If for somebody to call it, they just need to type show year followed by the empty parentheses, because this function doesn't take any parameters. And they could do something like this, and it would cause this code to execute and pop up an alert that says the year is, and tell us what year it is. Here's another function that actually does have a parameter, and this is a very common function that doesn't use a good name, but it's used very, very often. It's almost it's a coding convention that almost everybody uses now, and it's called the dollar function. A lot of times we call it the dollar function, and the dollar function merely takes a selector as a parameter. And all it does is do document.querySelector. We talked about document.querySelector in a previous video. And we know that we can do document.querySelector and provide it a selector, and it will return all the items that use that selector. So if it's an ID, it would get all the things with that. It would get the object with the ID on it. It would get the piece of the web page with the ID. Or if we passed it a class, it would return the class. The section of HTML that has that class applied to it. So the only thing it really does is the same thing we were doing before, but the dollar sign, which is treated just like a character by JavaScript. So this is a valid name for a function, just shortens this document.querySelector. So now we have to do is type $, and give it a selector, and it actually does this long statement. So we put this at the top of our code. We don't have to type document.querySelector every time we want to query for a selector. We can just type the $ followed by a selector. So here's an example similar to some examples we saw earlier. We're looking for, maybe it's a text box that somebody can type their email address in, and that text box has an ID of email 1. We can use the $ to query that selector and then pull its value out using .value and assign that to this constant called email1. So the dollar function doesn't technically follow good naming conventions. Its purpose is to shorten the document.querySelector method into something shorter, so it doesn't just makes our code shorter and easier to read. So get used to seeing that one, because we'll see it a lot. So here's a function called calculate tax. This is the declaration. We have the function keyword followed by the name of the function, which is calculate tax. The name tells us what this function does. And this one takes two parameters inside the parentheses that follow the name. It requires us to provide it a subtotal, and the comma separates and tells us we also have to provide a tax rate. And then it's going to take these two parameters and it's going to use them, subtotal times tax rate. It's going to store them, it's going to multiply them and store them in this tax constant. And then it's going to return the tax rounded to 2 decimal places. So here is the function, and down here is the code that's used to call it. We have a subtotal of $85. We declare a tax rate of 0.05, and then we call calculate tax, pass it the subtotal and the tax rate, so it's going to pass it 85 and 0.05. This function will take those two things, multiply them, and return them, and they'll be stored in the sales tax variable, and then we'll pop up an alert that tells us that the sales tax is $425. So we've moved off the calculating of the tax. Instead of putting that in our main code, we've moved it off into its own function, which makes our code shorter, easier to read, and more modular. Easier to maintain because we can maintain this block separately from all the other blocks. We use a lot of functions to divide up problems into smaller problems. So we're going to look at some other kinds of functions in the upcoming videos, but that does it for basic JavaScript functions.